Before I begin this video, I feel compelled to start with two huge disclaimers for those of you who are new to this channel. Number one, I do not support the North Korean regime. I firmly believe that the North Korean regime is a deplorable, despicable, evil regime that belongs in the garbage bin of history, along with every other state that would impress with force its will upon innocent people. You might ask, then why do I have a channel dedicated to content from North Korea? That's a perfectly acceptable question to ask. I review content from North Korea primarily for two reasons. The first being that I feel people are too quick to fall for the pop culture perception of North Korea as this evil country full of mustache-twirling villains looking for ways to take over the world. And with my channel, I attempt to show people that North Koreans are human beings just like us. They have thoughts, feelings, and ideas just like you or me. They enjoy music, TV, movies, they fall in love, just like us. The second reason is, I review movies primarily because I don't believe that North Korea is going to be around much longer. Fortunate as that may be, when North Korea does collapse, these films will be all that we have left that gives us a visual of what life in North Korea was supposed to be like, what it looked like, etc. Besides, anyone who actually watches my videos in length will know that I am severely critical of the regime in all of my videos. I am a firm supporter of the South Korean government. I lived in South Korea, it's where I met my wife. Wonderful country. I believe that a unified Korea under a southern regime is the only way for a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous future for all of Korea. So that's disclaimer number one. Disclaimer number two is that I truly believe that the vast majority of North Korean defectors, as well as North Koreans in general, are good people. I've had the pleasure of speaking to several North Korean defectors when I was living in the South, and I can say firsthand that they were some of the kindest, cheerful, sweetest people I'd ever met. I've also talked to a North Korean who wasn't actually a defector. I believe that all North Korean defectors, as well as all refugees, should be given the benefit of a doubt. I think that it is extremely immoral and wrong to demonize, harass, and intimidate those who flee their homeland in search of a better life. It is something that I would never advocate for or do myself under any circumstances. So why then am I making a video about Yeonmi Park, undoubtedly the most famous North Korean defector, whom I came to dub the Anne Frank of North Korea? Well, for starters, it's important that I tell you that I used to very much believe in Yeonmi's story just like the millions of others out there. I bought her book, twice in fact. I read it cover to cover on more than one occasion. I watched her speeches and interviews, and I too was moved by her incredible tale of perseverance and her determination to escape from North Korea to a better life. But then I saw this video. This video is by far the most famous of her speeches, where, dressed in her hanbok, Mrs. Park delivers a powerful speech between her incorrigible sobbing about the horrors of North Korea and her story. As I watched the video, I began to realize something though. The story that she tells in this video is markedly different from the one that's in her book. I began to think to myself, why is this so different? So I began to dig a little deeper. I began to research, and I watched some of her interviews that she did in Korea, interviews that the vast majority of foreigners don't see because they don't speak the language. Soon after, I started realizing that almost every instance she gives this speech, it's considerably different. Allow me to clarify. I know no one can give the exact same speech twice, let alone several times. Moreover, it's the details surrounding this incredibly horrifying and traumatic experience. The details of which a person wouldn't mix up get mixed up. Now, for complete transparency, I'm going to be primarily referencing either from the interviews she conducted or from an article written by Mary Ann Jolly called The Strange Tale of Yeonmi Park. A great article, by the way, that I'll be linking in the description below. I'll also be cross-referencing her statements from her interviews with her official version of the story in her book. I encourage everyone who has a copy of this book to grab it off the shelf, or if you don't have a copy, head down to your local library, check it out if it's available. However you can get your hands on it for transparency's sake, crack it open and we'll read it together. So, for starters, let's get into the first part of her story when she talks about her time growing up in Haesan, a very poor city in the northwestern part of the country. In the interview she gave at the Young World Summit, she mentions about her mother's friend being executed by a firing squad in the city stadium for watching a foreign film.
When I was 9 years old, I saw my friend's mother publicly executed. Her crime? Watching a Hollywood movie.
Okay. Well, throughout multiple different interviews, people have asked her what movie she was watching, and in one interview she states with absolute confidence that it was a South Korean drama.
So the public execution when I was 9 years old, and my friend's best friend mom being killed in front of me. But she saw the South Korean DVDs, and that was the reason for her to be killed. So in the public again, nobody can complain about it. We have to accept it's our government to wear, and what can we do about it?
Whereas in another interview she did in Europe, she said implicitly that it was a James Bond film. Now, of course, that's not my smoking gun against her, but with that in mind, let's get on to my next point. The second part is the whole situation itself. Mrs. Park claims that the execution took place in 2002 when she was 9 years old. Now, that in of itself would seem innocuous. We know that North Korea regularly executed people for, quote, political offenses. However, since Mrs. Park made this statement, there have been testimonies from other defectors who wish to remain anonymous in the article, who were in Haesan at the time Mrs. Park described. These defectors have gone on to claim that not only did executions never take place within the city itself, they were always on the outside of the city, mostly in the airport, but that executions in Haesan had stopped altogether in 1999, 3 years before Yeonmi said the execution took place. They also said it was extremely unlikely for anyone to be executed for watching a foreign film. One defector apparently laughed at the question when it was asked if such a punishment were possible. So, I feel like when Mrs. Park tells the story, she's playing off the popular misconception that people have, that North Korea just deliberately executes scores of its own citizens every day for minor offenses, and forces people to watch. And by all means, North Korea has done this, and I'm not claiming that they don't. However, according to other defectors, public executions are typically reserved for serious crimes like murder, rape, treason, etc. Other analysts, such as Andrei Lankoff, who was an exchange student in Pyongyang in the 1980s and is regarded by many as the premier expert on the country, commented on Yeonmi's statement, saying, "I am very, very skeptical whether watching a Western movie would lead to an execution. An arrest for such an action is possible indeed, but still not very likely." Furthermore, he added that public executions are typically reserved for crimes such as murder, large-scale theft, especially of the government property, sometimes involvement with large-scale smuggling operations, including human trafficking. For the sake of fairness, I do need to point out that Mrs. Park wrote back to the author of the article explaining the shooting. In her rebuttal, which is posted at the bottom of the article, she states that she never actually saw anyone executed in Haesan, and that the execution took place in her aunt's then nameless village in order to protect their identities. The village has since been revealed in her book to be the village of Kowon. However, even this rebuttal is contradicted by Yeonmi later in her book. In her rebuttal, she says clearly that, quote, "I never said that I saw executions in Haesan." Yet, in her book, page 51 of the English edition, she clearly states that she saw a man executed in Haesan for eating beef. It's also worth noting that in her book, which was published a little under a year after this article was written, has omitted the story of her mother's friend's execution entirely. I feel that I should reiterate that I am not defending North Korea. You must always investigate something with a neutral point of view. It's very hard to be neutral when you're talking about a country like North Korea, because North Korea is one of those black and white topics where on one side you have people who actually defend the regime, and on the other side you have, I think, the average citizen, the average pop culture believing citizen who thinks that North Korea is, again, this absolute evil country full of people who are just plotting to take over the world. And both sides, I think, are extreme. There's a saying that I like which goes, there's one side to the story, then there's the other side, and then somewhere in the middle, there's the truth. So, I feel like when you try to be neutral in any inquiry about North Korea, you get attacked from both sides. The lunatics who support the regime will call me a traitor or a Western imperialist, whatever the fuck that means. While on the other side, you'll get the suburban soccer moms who think essential oils are a good substitute for vaccines, who will lambast me for defending the regime. People who don't understand what it means to be objective about anything. So I want to make that perfectly clear. I'm trying to be as neutral as possible. You have to meet every claim with skepticism. You need to have evidence to support your claim. Mrs. Park unfortunately doesn't have any evidence to back up her claim about her mother's friend. Now, am I saying that she's lying? No, I'm simply saying that she doesn't have any concrete evidence to prove that it happened. She is making the assertive claim. You have to back that up. I can already hear the deriders now saying, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Yeah, that's a cute saying and all, but that line of reasoning doesn't work in this camp. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And there is a lot of evidence to the contrary of Mrs. Park's claims about the alleged execution. And to those who would assert that the defectors who called out Yeonmi's story as untrue are liars, I would like you to ask yourself something. What would the defectors who remained anonymous, mind you, have to gain by throwing Mrs. Park under the bus? Why would they go out of their way to defend the country that they ran away from? The country that would likely imprison them if they returned, and that probably maybe imprison their families for leaving. Why would they just decide it would be a good idea to invalidate who is undeniably the most prominent anti-Kim person in existence today? It clearly wasn't for fame if they were anonymous. It doesn't make sense. These are people who likely went through the same traumatic experiences as Yeonmi. There's no rational way you can dismiss these people who are disputing what she's saying. There's simply nothing in it for them. So moving on, in her book, the first part is more or less dedicated to her time growing up in Haesan, while detailing her life from her father's illicit business to her relationship with her sister Eunmi and her mother. Her father and mother were ultimately arrested for illegally trading in China. Park said, quote, "We couldn't go to school. We would go down to the river and wash our clothes there. Then we would go to the mountain to get grass to eat." However, in a BBC interview on October 16, 2014, she told interviewers that she and her sister went to live with her aunt in the countryside where they continued to eat grass and things of that nature. However, just 2 days later, she told another news outlet, the Irish Independent, that she survived by finding food to eat and learning to cook and didn't move from Haesan. In fact, one of the reporters even asks, "Were there any adults that knew you were alone?" Mrs. Park replied, "No, people were dying there. They don't care. I saw lots of dead bodies on the streets, and no one can take care of anyone." So, once again, we seem to have two completely contradicting stories that are 2 days apart from each other. Furthermore, what's even more interesting is that on the South Korean television show called Now on My Way to Meet You, which features Yeonmi and her mother as well as other North Korean defectors, we get another story. The host asks Yeonmi's mother, and what a rough translation is, "When we talk about people starving or not having enough to eat, your daughter says that didn't happen. Why is that? Did you and Yeonmi not go through these experiences?" Her mother then replies, "We did not to that extent. We were never in a position to where we were starving." So now it seems that we have 3 separate accounts of what happened in Yeonmi's childhood. Now in her book, she tries to take all of those past stories and shoehorn them together to make it seem like one consistent story. In the book, after her parents go to jail, they do try to survive for a time by themselves before they're taken to their aunt's house where they stay for a time. Mrs. Park has also gone on to say that her book is the official story of everything that happened. But, you see, here's the problem with that. Just because the book is the final word, that doesn't erase what you said in the past. It doesn't erase all of the contradictions and inconsistencies that are told often days apart from each other. And you can say that she's not contradicting herself and just relaying different parts of her story and put it all into one book, but that doesn't really work when she's literally denying what she said just days prior. She said on BBC Radio that she went to go live with her aunt after her parents were jailed, yet 2 days later she said she never did that she took care of herself and her sister in Haesan, and that no adults knew they were there. So we start getting a theme that in the interviews she gives to the West, she tends to portray herself as this girl who was starving, living off of dragonflies and grass, while in her South Korean TV show, she's saying that they were rich and never starved like others, and then her mother backs all of this up. Furthermore, in that same episode of Now on My Way to Meet You, her mother goes on to say, quote,
많이 고생을 했어요. 근데 자식들은 잘 모르죠. 방송에 출연하면서 우리 예주가 북한의 실태를 더 잘 알게 된 계기라고 생각해요.
예주양은 여기 와서 배운 것 같아요.
예,
그러니까.
자기가 어떤 때는 엄마한테 전화를 해요. 이 방송을 녹화를 하고 엄마 내가 진짜 북한 아이가 얽힌 어른가. 다른 언니들이 하는 말이 무슨 말인지 자기는 전혀 모르겠대요. 자꾸 거짓말을 한다는 거예요.
그러니까
예.
처음에 와서 그러더라고요.
예. 그래 내가 막
So, in other words, her mother is essentially saying that Yeonmi knew nothing about the abject poverty that surrounded her in her homeland, and that she thinks that everyone on the show is lying because she lived an affluent life. It is also worth noting that Yeonmi makes no objection to her mother's words in the episode. Again, this is something that she neglected to tell us Westerners. So, moving on, Yeonmi's book is separated into 3 sections, the first being her time growing up in North Korea, the second is her escape and life in China, and the final part is her escape to Mongolia and resettlement in South Korea. I'm not going to talk about South Korea at all because at that point she's just an ordinary citizen. Her stories about her time in South Korea are irrelevant. I'm also not going to go very much into detail about her time in China because the majority of it deals with issues such as rape, sexual assault, sex trafficking, and whatnot. I'm not going to touch that. I don't have any evidence to suggest that it didn't occur. And it is common knowledge that it is a tragically common occurrence among female defectors, so I'm not even going there. However, there are 2 elements that I'm going to go over, and that is how she got to China and in regard to how her father's remains were disposed of. In regard to how she fled China, Yeonmi initially stated in another libertarian radio show in San Francisco, which again will be linked below, she mentioned that they crossed the icy river of Haesan on foot without their father, whom was subsequently brought much later in the story. They were then allegedly immediately sold into sex work by their brokers, where her mother was promptly raped in front of her. This is the version of her story that makes it into her book. However, in an earlier interview on her libertarian podcast Freedom Factory, the episode of which I will link below, she tells her co-host that, after telling him yet again that they were never starving or ate grass, that she fled to the Chinese city of Changbai by car, which they were able to secure thanks to her father's lofty connections. She also mentioned that she left with her mom, dad, and her sister Eunmi. Now, I could see why she wouldn't want to divulge that part of her story if it was true. Sexual trauma is horrific and in many cases leaves permanent mental and physical scars that never go away. So I can sympathize with her should that be the case. However, there's also the chance that she could have just made up the story of fleeing on foot and being sold into trafficking because it sounds more traumatic and makes for a better story. So, I'm gonna leave it up for you to decide. Another thing that caught my attention was in her book on page 121, she describes being taken through the footpaths through the mountains in order to reach the river to Changbai. Mind you, she's back in Haesan with her parents at this point. She has also stated this in numerous interviews. Now, you see, there's only one real problem with that. There are no mountains directly dividing Haesan and Changbai, so let me show you. Now we're going to take a look at our final point in the Chinese part of her story, her father's untimely death. Her father does pass away from cancer, and again, initially she claimed that as a 14-year-old girl, she, along with her mother and 2 others, carried her father's corpse up to a barren mountain and buried him herself. Once again, however, Yeonmi has told 2 different accounts of this story. In later interviews as well as in her book, she claims that he was cremated. In fact, let's break out our book, everyone. If you have your copy, let's go to page 167 and let's read together. She clearly states, and I quote, "It took an hour or so for the flames to finish their work. When it was over, there was nothing left but dust and bones.
We had to leave quickly or risk being discovered. So, I began to scoop my father's ashes into a box I'd brought with me. Then I put my father's picture inside of the box. I faced the box towards the flowing river so that my father could see it while he waited for me to return. I had never felt so alone in my life. Now, the last point that I want to make for this video, during Yeonmi's escape to Mongolia, where she was detained by Mongolian border authorities, in an interview with the Daily Beast, she said she was taken to a detention center where she was held for months, during which they would order her to strip naked and do, well, you know, awful things to her. Yet again, Mrs. Park's story changed. In her book, pages 201 through 206 detail her entire experience in Mongolia, where she only mentions that she is stripped initially to check if she was smuggling drugs. The author of The Diplomat actually went as far as to contact Kim Hyun-ah and Professor Shi Eun-yu, who both worked for the South Korean Center for North Korean Refugees, otherwise known as Hanawon, to ask if anyone had ever reported being forced to strip in Mongolian detention centers. Both of their responses were, "It's not possible," citing that Mongolia is the most supportive country of North Korean defectors in all of mainland Asia, going as far as to allow South Korean psychologists to come to help them cope with any trauma. To date, no evidence or testimony has surfaced about these alleged supposed regular occurrences. Now, there are a number of other smaller inconsistencies I could point out, such as the conflicting time periods for which Yeonmi stated her father was imprisoned, or her statement saying that people in the movie Titanic had better technology than North Koreans. VCRs, DVD players, Nintendo Entertainment Systems, and television didn't exist in 1912, Yeonmi. But those to me are rather minor, so I'm just going to rest my case at this point. So what do I think? My personal opinion is that, at least, she is being very disingenuous. I think that the evidence at this point is overwhelming. I think that it's concrete, well-sourced, cross-referenced, it's irrefutable. There have been numerous instances of her giving completely different accounts of what happened just days apart. We have evidence of her telling Western media one thing while back at home in South Korea telling their media the complete opposite. These are differences that go far beyond the lost in translation excuse that she likes to throw around. I think at this point there's no shadow of a doubt that Mrs. Yeonmi at best got caught in a snowball of lies and had to keep going with it or risk losing her credibility, or at the worst, she deliberately planned this upon seeing how much money it could bring her. Either way, it's wrong and the truth deserves to come out, and I hope that it does. So now, the question is, if it is true that she's been lying about her experiences, why? Why would Yeonmi lie about her life in North Korea and her subsequent escape? Well, I think the answer is very simple. Money. I think that she simply just saw the amount of money she could make if she exaggerated her story. There are tens of thousands of North Korean defectors out there. Not all of them are famous. It's only the ones with the emotionally charged, horrific stories that get any worthwhile attention from the press. People in the West are desperate for any kind of information on North Korea, and a beautifully tragic story by Yeonmi Park, which reaffirms everyone's assumptions about North Korea, is a perfect way to keep the checks coming. So, it's entirely plausible to assume that she took what she learned from her fellow co-stars on her show in South Korea and started telling her wildly exaggerated, hastily put together sob story to foreign media, who flocked to it without doing any modicum of fact-checking, which would reveal the fact that her story in South Korea was precisely the opposite. All the while, anyone who does manage to do any fact-checking is quickly marginalized or is accused of supporting North Korea and is written off. Because if there's one thing people love more than journalistic integrity, it's a great sob story. I'm not trying to say that there's a conspiracy against people like me or Marianne Jolly. I'm just saying that, to be honest, there isn't a lot of articles or news sources out there that attempt to scrutinize her story, or the story of any other prominent North Korean defector. This article by Marianne Jolly is really one of the few articles that called her story into question, and I commend the author once more for writing this. It's a great article. I will reiterate one last time that I am not a North Korean apologist. I despise that regime with every ounce of my being. But do you know what I despise more? Liars. People who would take the stories of other survivors, the horrors that others have experienced fleeing that country, and twist it to make their own experience more interesting, to feed their own ego or for money. To me, that's the textbook definition of abhorrent.
And Yeonmi, should this be true that she is doing that, would not be the only North Korean defector to do this. Shin Dong-hyuk, the man behind the famous book Escape from Camp 14, also infamously was forced to recant much of his story in the book after being called out by none other than his own father, among other defectors. I'll end with this. There are those of you who think I shouldn't question defector testimonies because it makes me look like I'm denying the atrocities going on in North Korea this very second. And to those people, I have a question I would like to ask you. Imagine if it came out that the Diary of Anne Frank, imagine if, hypothetically of course, it came out that it was a hoax, that it never happened, that it was written by her father to cash in on the Holocaust. Can you imagine the fallout that would result from such a revelation? Imagine what that would do. Now, of course, taking that into consideration, would that mean that the Holocaust never happened? Of course not. The Holocaust absolutely still occurred, even in this hypothetical scenario. But think about what that would do for the Holocaust deniers out there, for the neo-Nazis who support National Socialism. Think about how much that would embolden their cause if it came to be that the Diary of Anne Frank was a hoax, how much ammunition that would give them to feed their horrible ideology. Park Yeonmi is the closest thing North Korea has to Anne Frank, in my opinion, and if it came to light that Park Yeonmi's book is a hoax, which again, I personally think it is, if it comes to the mainstream that this book is a hoax, imagine what that would do to the North Korean regime. They would have a propaganda field day with it. They would denounce Yeonmi Park, and the regime would stand taller than ever among its detractors. If it is true that she has fabricated this whole story, then Yeonmi Park's lies and deceit are nothing more than a spit in the face to every individual who has ever suffered under that horrific regime, and every single person who has risked their life to get away from it. And the longer we continue to look away from the contradictions, lies, and inconsistencies, the more we are failing ourselves as critical thinkers, as well as other defectors with genuine stories to tell. Now, of course, despite me being as thorough as possible as far as laying out my case for you, I still want all of you to do your own research. Do not let me speak for you. If you own a copy of her book, or if you're conflicted about giving her your money, go to your local library, open it up, cross-reference with other interviews, read articles, research it for yourself. Because despite my strong opinion on this matter, it's still my personal opinion. I don't know 100% for sure what happened, only she does. All I can do is gather what evidence I do have and make an assumption based upon the evidence to the best of my ability. It goes without saying that I don't want to be right. I want Yeonmi Park's story to be true. I want to be able to believe every North Korean defector out there. I want to be wrong. But unfortunately, I have a feeling that I'm not. Nevertheless, everyone, do your own research and come up with your own conclusion. Thank you, and have a nice day.